Chapter 3. Kismet. In those days, almost anyone could afford to drive. For better or worse, insurance was not required, and gas cost less than 35 cents a gallon, which in 2022 I looked and adjusted for inflation is about $3 a gallon. Half the cars on the road were clunkers. Mary's old sedan had a short circuit. Charlie used to get out, open the hood, and hocus pocus it. He tinkered and tapped, explaining that you have to act like you know what you're doing, and sometimes you get lucky. Incidentally, he believed in patience, sweet talk, and attention to water and oil. It kept the tread-worn tires rolling, and our mind traveling, the past, present, and rarely the future. Being present for life was becoming real to me. But we wanted to know about his past, and it came out randomly. When we saw hobos in open boxcars, he said, "I left town in a boxcar out of Charleston at 6 or 7 years old." And I was skeptical. He said, "My grandmother got me back. Granddad was a World War I vet and a railroad man. All the family got a free pass to ride the skunk. That's what they called the stinking train that hooked up to other farms. There used to be a difference," he said, "between hobos, tramps, and bums. The Depression was hard on people, and men rode the rails looking for work. Some carried hoes on their shoulders." He said a tramp was basically a traveler. No matter what condition the economy, it might work from time to time and place to place. And a bum was pretty much always looking for a handout. These solitary individuals shared solidarity, he said, in codes and symbols they scratched on posts and the sides of old buildings to tell if a town was friendly or hostile, to watch out for police, railroad detectives, and so on. We got off the main road one night in a dark industrial town of chain-link fences, smokestack factories, railroad tracks, and warehouses. A red-lit guardrail and ringing bell stopped us at a crossing. While watching the passing train, Charlie said, "The cars are like thoughts. To know the all of thought, you gotta see between them." I darted my eyes between the rolling thoughts and got dizzy. "You could look at the cars as lifetimes," he continued, "and the spaces between are called nowhere and nothing and everywhere and everything. And you just ride in your own car, and the time track goes forever in both directions. Yet, it's always now." Any understanding I have of Charlie came without my trying, and is my interpretation. He used the words, the all of thought, for what I'd call the universe. He said, "Now is like thinking a parade of 5,000 years in a minute, a week, a year. And most of the thoughts in your world were set years ago in prisons and nut houses." He said he heard the expression "right on" in the 1950s, but that it didn't become common on the streets till the 60s. The word hip, he said, came from the old prisons in New York, where dopers shot heroin in their hips. Are you hip? Meant, do you use junk? Then it got mixed in with old whorehouse music, pimp, and con games. The significance of all this is up for grabs. We listened because it was interesting, and so much of the life we came from was not. He knew all kinds of languages and slangs. He sang us a song he'd written entirely in Australian rhyme slang, a language that originated in the rough Australian prisons of the 1800s. In the lingo, dots and dies were eyes. I suppose the nose, north and south the mouth, and so on. It seemed too obvious for obfuscation, but when spoken fast enough, it must have bypassed somebody. That twist and twirl used a lady from Bristol to get in the jelly and jar. Sometimes he used slang that is today an excuse to take offense. Mick, Mac, Doggo, and Spade were common amongst prisoners and hipsters. I heard no protest nor anyone offended by those terms. Negro was definitely out, like colored before it. And nigger was not one of Charlie's words. There was a Spanish word for blacks that he used right after he got out of prison. It sounded like my ate, and I don't know what it meant. Which, just an interlude, but the word really is mayate, and it still pretty much means that to this day. The caboose came by, the guardrail raised, and there was the space between the thoughts. We drove off into nothingness. Indistinct roadside shapes became mammoth machinery, and blocks of factories soon surrounded us in a dark maze. I was hungry. Wheeling around the corners of empty streets, he seemed unconscious of the late hour and the fact that we hadn't eaten anything. He joked, "We couldn't have made a wrong turn. We're not going anywhere." Then our headlights struck something. He swerved, opened his door, pulled in a brown paper bag, and handed it to me for inventory. I took out 1 quart of milk, corn chips, sliced cheese, bologna, and cupcakes. I was agape. Of course. Mary piped from the back seat. He grinned. How and who left this? No one was around to ask. It can't be overemphasized how remarkably often these perfect things happened with him. And increasingly, it seemed to me we were exactly where we were supposed to be at all times. Even in the music. Songs on the radio were tributes to the eccentric and free-spirited, to wanderlust and travelers with guitars who valued music more than money. The last time folk music was popular, hard scrabble folks roamed the land, and owning a radio was a luxury. Charlie reminisced as though it was ridiculous to depart from the present, yet with droll affection. He remembered Smilin' Jack and Orphan Annie in the comic strips, and 3 decades of songs and singers of all genres. Hank Williams, he said, was called Luke the Drifter, and Lefty Frizzle sang, "We will travel far, just me and my guitar." On a hot day, we got out of the car to stretch our legs at a Central California town park. Charlie brought his guitar onto an amphitheater stage, and within minutes, little kids were coming from all directions. It was surreal. They were climbing up on the stage and dancing. I'd never seen anything like it. After Charlie himself became overwhelmed, he crept down off the stage. We regrouped on the outskirts of the park, attracting 3 small boys who appeared to be brothers. Their initial excitement over the guitar quickly turned them inexplicably mean, and they began to hit each other. Charlie stopped playing, calling, "Hey! Hey!" and they ran away. I thought the behavior was typical, but he mulled it over. Later, on the road, out of a blue silence, he concluded. That's the kind of love they were shown. That's the only way some people know how to touch each other. And after another silence, kids pick up whatever you show them, even when they sleep. Charlie was almost 4 when Kathleen Maddox turned 20 in the West Virginia State Penitentiary at Moundsville. He remembered visiting her there and hearing her tell of having seen terrible things. When he was 6 and caught taking the train, he told his captors that it was okay because his grandfather was the conductor and he was allowed to ride. A conductor in life, his grandfather had actually died before he was born. The family lived by his legacy. Charlie remembered his grandmother as a good woman, but so obsessively religious she had pushed her youngest daughter away from home. Living alternately with his grandmother and with relatives in Kentucky, he'd struggled to fit in where kids were already living. He remembered stealing canned milk from a refrigerator and drinking it in a closet. And he remembered that when his mother got out of prison, she came for him. Erratically, Kathleen kept Charlie and left him in the care of others, some of whom were not kin. She had once run out of money while playing poker and, on a lark, bet him. He recalled the other ladies laughing when he had to go home with the winner. He was sent to live with his grandmother one Christmas, and his cousins were there, receiving toys, including a dollhouse and bicycles. Because of his late arrival, the adults had only one gift for him: a Superman hairbrush. His grandmother found him crying in a closet and explained to him that he had gotten the best gift of all, because if he brushed his hair with that hairbrush, he might be able to fly. He said his tears dried up. His smile came out. I brushed and brushed, caped a rag around my neck, and I was off to fly. Flying hadn't worked out for Charlie, as he would later tell, but his can-do attitude survived. His appreciation for our talents and abilities encouraged us. You could say that he played us, but it was to good effect. He asked me to do a little dance one day when we'd stopped for gas. A few leaps and a twirl in front of a service station attendant, and I felt like I'd choreographed a musical. He kept nudging us to sing and play instruments. That would be a long time coming. Shyness was called cute when I was a kid, but it wasn't cute. It was just as he said. We were cheating ourselves of a simple pleasure. They called them boys' schools, but the places Charlie was left for lack of stable parents sounded like jails. He was vulnerable, he said, because he had no one outside to speak up for him. A few of his relatives said they were coming to visit. Boys with visitors were made to dress in shirts and ties and wait on a bench. Charlie said he got dressed up and waited, but they didn't come. His mother gave notice that she would be coming, and he waited expectantly, but she didn't come either. Too many times, he said. He'd waited on the bench, watching other kids leave, but his people didn't come. When they finally came, and he was able, he took off running. Caught and returned to the school, he was punished and told he was ungrateful. He would later lament that most of his youth was spent in a room with a bed, a table, and a locker. He imagined having a bicycle. He always wanted a kite, and at every opportunity, he ran away. Once he got stuck in a ventilator and had to be sought out. And once he and a swarm of kids broke out and ran in different directions, believing that at least they all wouldn't get caught. At 12 or 13, he escaped, robbed a gas station, and was picked up walking around town in a new cowboy shirt with $300 rolled in one pocket. Later, he was put with older kids and learned lock-picking, pocket-picking, and things like that. He and the kids in a gang pierced their foreskins and hung small phosphorescent skulls from their penises. Whenever a certain teacher walked by, they stood at the fence, shaking their skulls at her. He said that her expression was worth the possible punishment. Charlie said he wouldn't wish his life on anyone, yet he was not sorry for any of it. He didn't say prison was a good place to be. He said it was the only home people like him have known, that there was heartache, but also soul. He used the word soul at different times in relation to feeling, knowing, and love. Describing newborn babies as soul or holes in the universe, he said, in total helplessness and openness, they absorb all they are shown. Father Mike understood the contemplative life, theoretically. His exposure to prayer and solitude, Charlie suggested, might allow him to understand how one could come to know things he didn't realize he knew. Mike responded as he often did, with a tight smile, signaling bemusement and no understanding at all. Charlie said that in solitary confinement, he'd begun to realize that he knew things without knowing how he knew them. He said he came to believe that knowledge is available to anyone who wants to know. Then I figured out, he went on, there ain't nothing to figure out. This tickled him, as though it were a joke played by the universe. He said, Everything just is. No big mystical questions or answers. Mike wasn't sure he liked that. I think he had a penchant for doctrine. I didn't like it either. Figuring out stuff is one of the world's greatest passions. But Charlie said he wasn't talking about medical research. He was talking about questions like the meaning of life. He complained to Mike, "A society built on fear and doubt teaches and preaches away from faith. If you don't have faith in yourself, you won't see it in me to know it. Not in me or in anyone. Not Christ, God, life, or anything at all. People who teach you away from yourself are trying to give you an old self that was given to them in the past. In a world of faith, knowing comes first, then learning. Knowing first, faith first. Then let the kids decide what they want to learn." Mike looked hopeful and doubtful. His doubt was well-founded. As Catholics, we were taught we were born dumb and sinful. The hierarchy of our church would enlighten us. Charlie said, "I have never had anyone I could count on outside myself. But I found out that's all I needed." It sounded like bragging, but he also said that he'd known many men who were like fathers to him. He said, "I looked into a lot of brains. Even Alvin Karpus was like a dad to me." He recounted to Mike his time in the Catholic boys' school run by monks with straps and paddles. Those monks drew a hard line, but they showed me unity of will and mind. It wasn't easy to get away from them because them guys could almost see what I was thinking. But I did. He'd also done time under ex-military men. In '49, I escaped, took the doctor's car, and got busted in Salt Lake City. They sent me to National Boys School in Washington, D.C. I worked in the dentist's office under MTAs who were all retired Navy. I raised myself, but the men in service taught me respect for the truth. Some of them were like dads, even though I thought of men of school as dumb-witted and slow to think. He'd had to be fast. In Chicago, he said, you had to fight to keep food in a blanket. He'd seen a lot of kids whose mothers made them weak and subject to being overtaken by other men. But he said that almost always, when a kid was willing to fight, other guys left him alone, that it was a matter of respect. He said he used to feel that being smaller than other guys was a bad thing, but that, while in the hole, he thought, well, it's not the muscles that count, or how tall or short, but how much heart you got. Muffet was often restricted to the car during our travels. Charlie said it wasn't fair. Mary's eyes watered, and they talked about finding her a home. Then in Santa Barbara, she wandered away, something she had never done before. Mary and Charlie walked the streets calling for her. The following day, we spotted her by the hamburger stand, eating handouts from kids. She came to the house another day, but wasn't hungry, and that was the last we saw of her. At the time, it seemed that Muffet was prescient and resourceful. But I think now that we should have found her a home. Muffet's departure is one of several reasons Santa Barbara is a milestone in my memory. Another is that Mary had learned she was pregnant. We were all happy about it. I think Charlie most of all. We applied for driver's licenses, and we almost got married, all three of us. It was a lark and illegal. But we would get licenses first in Santa Barbara and then in San Francisco. The driver's licensing process would take several weeks, but we never went through with the marriages. We got word that Charlie's parole officer wanted to see him. He left, telling us he would hitchhike to San Francisco and return in 2 weeks. I didn't want to be married. For the past decade, more and more people had opted to leave churches and governments out of their unions. I think that Charlie suggested the double marriage to secure our commitments. I also think that Mary would have liked to have been married. But after meeting Charlie, she'd begun to give up what she wanted. And, willful as she was, these were major sacrifices. Charlie seemed to think it significant that he had never divorced his wife. The three of us could be married in truth, he concluded. But he had legally married to Rose, the girl he'd brought to California. She'd given birth to a son, and, as Charlie was in prison, she'd filed for divorce, changed the boy's name, and moved away. "I never divorced her," he said once. And later he added, "It would be better for a man to have 100 wives than to divorce one."